The day I opened my bank account in front of my family, nobody said a word. Not my mother, not my two older brothers, not my Aunt Cecile, who had an opinion about everything and had never once kept it to herself. Not even my grandmother, who had been talking nonstop since the moment she arrived that Sunday afternoon. They all went completely silent. My mother looked at the screen on my phone for what felt like a full minute. Her reading glasses were pushed up on her forehead the way they always were when she was not expecting to need them. She had to pull them down to read the number properly. When she did, she set the phone on the kitchen table very slowly, like it might break, like she might break. I did not say I told you so. I did not cry. I did not remind anyone in that room of every Sunday dinner where they had looked at me with that particular expression. The one that was not quite pity and not quite disappointment, but lived somewhere in between. The expression that said, "We love you, but we do not believe in you, and we are not sure those two things can coexist without it being painful for everyone." I just picked up my phone, slid it back into my pocket, and said, "Lunch is ready. Should we eat?" This is the story of how I got to that kitchen table. It is not a short story, it is not a simple one, but it is mine, and I am going to tell it to you from the beginning. My name is Natalie. I am 34 years old. I live in Atlanta, Georgia, in a house that I own outright in a neighborhood I specifically chose because it is exactly 4 miles from the water and has a farmer's market on Saturday mornings. I have a rescue dog named Fig who sleeps at the foot of my bed and has strong opinions about which shoes I should wear. I drink my coffee black and I read 3 books a month, and I am the kind of person who keeps a legal pad on the kitchen counter because I think better when I can write things down. I tell you all of this because I want you to see me as a complete person before I tell you the parts of this story that hurt. Because I think women in particular are often reduced to their pain in stories like this, and I refuse to be reduced. I grew up in a mid-sized city in South Carolina. Not a small town, but not a metropolis either. The kind of place where everyone knew at least 2 of your cousins, and the grocery store was also where you ran into your childhood Sunday school teacher every other Saturday. My father left when I was 7. I do not say that for sympathy. I say it because it is relevant to everything that comes after. When my father left, it did 2 things to my family. It made us financially tighter than we had ever been. And it made my mother decide, in a way I do not think she was fully conscious of, that the safest future for her children was one with guaranteed stability. A government job, a pension, a house in a familiar neighborhood, a life that could not be taken away because it was never built on anything risky enough to collapse. My mother, Sandra, worked as an administrative coordinator at the county school district for 22 years. She was excellent at her job. She was organized and dependable, and the kind of employee who trained the people who eventually promoted past her without ever once complaining about the unfairness of that arrangement. She raised 3 children largely on her own after my father left, me and my 2 older brothers, Darnell and Kevin. She did this while managing a house, maintaining relationships with an extended family that required a significant amount of social energy, and somehow always making sure there was a hot meal on the table by 6:30 on weeknights. My mother was capable of extraordinary things. She was just not capable of believing that her daughter was one of them. Let me tell you about Darnell and Kevin quickly because they matter to this story. Darnell was the oldest, 5 years older than me. He was built like my father apparently was, tall and broad-shouldered, with a laugh that filled a room before the joke even landed. Darnell worked in logistics. He had a good steady job managing a distribution warehouse. He owned a house, drove a decent truck, coached Little League on weekends. By every measure that my family used to evaluate a life, Darnell was successful. Kevin was 3 years older than me. Kevin had gone to a 2-year college and gotten a degree in computer networking. He worked for the county IT department, same employer as my mother for a while, which everyone found both convenient and reassuring. Kevin was married to a woman named Brenda. They had 2 children. They lived 12 minutes from my mother's house. Kevin was also successful by every measure my family used. And then there was me, Natalie, the youngest, the quiet one, the one who read too much and talked too little and had, according to my Aunt Cecile, always seemed like she was somewhere else even when she was standing right in front of you. I had gone to a 4-year university on a partial academic scholarship. I had studied business with a concentration in finance. I had graduated in the top 15% of my class. And then I had done the thing that my family could never quite forgive me for. I had moved to Atlanta, alone, without a job already secured, without knowing anyone in the city, without asking anyone's permission or opinion. My mother had stood in the driveway the morning I packed my car and said, "Natalie, you do not have to do this the hard way." I said, "Mama, I am not doing it the hard way. I am doing it my way." She had looked at me with that expression, the one that lived between pity and disappointment. She said, "I hope you know what you are doing." I said, "I will." She nodded the way you nod when you do not believe someone, but you have run out of arguments. I hugged her. I got in my car. I drove 7 hours to Atlanta, and I started building. Atlanta received me the way every serious city receives you when you arrive without connections, without reputation, and without the luxury of failure. Indifferently. I had $3,000 in a savings account, a studio apartment in a neighborhood that was being generously described as up and coming, and a business degree that nobody in any of the interviews I sat in during the first 3 months seemed particularly impressed by. I applied for 41 jobs in those first 12 weeks. I received 11 responses. I went on 7 interviews. I was offered 2 positions. I accepted the one that paid better by $4,000 annually, a junior financial analyst role at a mid-sized commercial real estate firm called Garrison Group. My starting salary was $43,000. I called my mother to tell her I had gotten the job. She said, "What does it pay?" I told her. She said, "Is there benefits?" I said yes. She said, "Good. Just do not get in over your head down there." She did not say congratulations. She did not say I knew you could do it. She said, "Do not get in over your head." I did not get in over my head. What I did was pay attention. Commercial real estate at its core is about understanding the relationship between money, location, and time. It is about seeing what a property is not yet and understanding what it could be. It is about patience and analysis and the willingness to trust numbers over emotion. I was built for all 3 of those things. Within 6 months at Garrison Group, I had taught myself the firm's full financial modeling system well enough that my supervisor, a woman named Renata, who had 15 years of experience and no patience for people who did not do their homework, began routing her more complicated analyses through me. She did not do this because she liked me especially. She did it because I got it right. I lived carefully in those first 2 years. The studio apartment cost me $720 a month. I furnished it from a combination of thrift stores and the Facebook marketplace. I drove a 2011 Honda Fit that I had purchased cash from a private seller for $5,000. I cooked almost every meal I ate. Every dollar I did not spend, I saved. And every few months I went back to the city I grew up in for a weekend, sat at my mother's table, and listened to the family talk about their lives. Those weekend visits were consistent in a way that made them almost predictable. Darnell would talk about the warehouse, about the new logistics software they were implementing, about Little League. Kevin would talk about the county IT system and how underfunded it was, and how he was probably the only person holding the whole thing together, which Brenda would confirm with the enthusiasm of a woman who had heard the story many times and still believed every word. My mother would cook and listen, and occasionally offer opinions that functioned less as opinions and more as verdicts. And at some point during every single visit, the conversation would turn to me. It always started with a question that sounded innocent. "How is Atlanta?" Or, "Are you meeting people down there?" Or, "Is that job going somewhere or is it just temporary?" The questions were never aggressive. My family was not aggressive. They were something more complicated than aggressive. They were convinced. They were already convinced that Atlanta was too big, that I was too alone, that a young woman by herself in a city like that building something in a field they did not understand was a story that was going to end with a phone call asking to come home. They were waiting for that phone call with a patience that bordered on tenderness. My Aunt Cecile was the most direct about it. Aunt Cecile was my mother's older sister, widowed, retired, and in possession of the kind of unearned confidence that comes from a lifetime of being the loudest person in every room. She loved me in the way that people love things they believe are fragile. Carefully, with a slight wince. At a family dinner about 18 months after I moved to Atlanta, she said, while passing the cornbread to my cousin, "Natalie, baby, you know it is not too late to come back home. Kevin could probably get you something at the county. Benefits are good." Kevin nodded enthusiastically because the county's benefits were, by his account, extraordinary. My mother said nothing, but looked at me in a way that said she was also curious about my answer. I said, "I am good where I am, Aunt Cecile. Thank you." She said, "I am just saying, sometimes the practical path is the right path." I said, "Yes, ma'am." I passed the cornbread. I said nothing else, but I heard it. I always heard it. Every just in case. Every, you know you can always. Every conversation that ended with someone saying they worried about me, which is the polite way of saying they did not believe the path I was on was going to hold my weight. I heard every single one, and I put every single one in a place inside me that was not anger and not bitterness, but something more useful. Fuel. Quiet, steady, sustainable fuel. The year I turned 28 was the year things got noticeably worse between me and my family. Not because I did anything wrong, because they started to realize I was not coming back. And instead of asking me why or trying to understand what I was building, they did what families sometimes do when they cannot explain something that does not fit their framework. They decided it needed to be fixed. It started with Kevin. Kevin called me on a Tuesday evening in March. We talked about surface things for the first few minutes, and then he shifted gears in that way he had, like a car that had been idling and suddenly accelerates without warning. He said, "Nat, I got to be honest with you. The family is worried." I said, "About what specifically?" He said, "About you being alone down there. About what happens if things fall through. You know Garrison is a small company. These things can fold." I said Garrison had been operating for 23 years and had a healthy balance sheet, and I would know better than most if something was wrong there. He said, "But you do not have a backup plan." I said, "I am my own backup plan, Kevin." There was a pause. He said, "That sounds good, but what does it actually mean?" I said, "It means I have been building something, and when it is ready, you will understand it." He said, "What are you building, Natalie?" And I made a decision in that moment that I have never regretted. I said, "I will show you when it is done." He told my mother about that conversation. My mother brought it up the next time I came home. She said, "Kevin says you were evasive when he asked about your plans." I said, "I was not evasive. I just do not share things before they are ready." She said, "Natalie, we are your family. We are not investors you need to impress." I said, "No, you are not." She heard something in that and did not push it further. But the expression came back, the one between pity and disappointment. And this time there was something new in it, a slight edge of something that looked almost like frustration, like she had been patient long enough and was running out of room for more patience. My cousin Destiny got engaged that spring. Destiny was 25, 3 years younger than me at the time, and her engagement was treated by the family as an event of almost cosmic significance. There was an engagement party at Aunt Cecile's house with 40 people and a custom cake and a photo display on the mantel showing Destiny and her fiancé Marcus from their first date to the proposal. I came home for the party. I was happy for Destiny. Genuinely. She was a warm person who deserved to be loved loudly. But I want to tell you what happened at that party, because it is important. At some point during the evening, Aunt Cecile gathered all the women in the family in the living room. It was the kind of gathering that happens at these events, informal and warm, women in a room talking about love and plans and the future. Aunt Cecile asked each of the younger women to share something about where they saw themselves in 5 years. 2 cousins talked about their careers. One talked about having children. Destiny talked about the wedding and the house she and Marcus were going to buy. Then Aunt Cecile looked at me. She said, "Natalie, what about you? What is the plan, baby?" 22 people in that room. I felt every eye. I said, "The plan is going well, Aunt Cecile. She said, "We need more than that." Someone laughed softly. I said, "I am building a financial life that I am proud of. The specifics are still in progress." Aunt Cecile said, "Still in progress. Lord Natalie, you have been in progress since you moved to Atlanta. When does it become finished?" My mother was in that room. She did not defend me. She looked at her hands. I said, "When it is exactly what I intended it to be." And I smiled. And I got up and refilled my glass of sweet tea and went to find Destiny and tell her the cake was beautiful. Because that was all I was willing to give that room. But that night in the guest bedroom of my aunt's house, I lay awake for 2 hours. Not crying. I want to be clear about that. I had moved past crying about this particular thing somewhere around year 2. But I was feeling something that I think a lot of women who are building quietly will recognize. The specific exhaustion of being underestimated by the people who should be your loudest supporters. The weight of carrying a vision that nobody around you can see yet. The loneliness of knowing exactly where you are going and being unable to share it, because sharing it requires a level of trust that has not been earned. I lay in that dark guest bedroom, and I looked at the ceiling, and I made myself a specific promise. I said, "Natalie, you do not need this room to believe in you in order to build it. You do not need their faith in order to have yours. Build it anyway. Build it quietly. Build it so well that when the time comes, no one in this family will be able to look at what you have created and find a single word to say." I closed my eyes. I slept. In the morning, I drove back to Atlanta, and I worked. Let me tell you what I was actually doing in Atlanta while my family was waiting for me to call and ask to come home. At Garrison Group, I had been promoted twice in 3 years. By year 3, I was a senior financial analyst managing the underwriting process for mid-market commercial acquisitions. My salary had grown from $43,000 to $78,000. I had also started doing something that nobody in my family knew about. About 14 months after I arrived in Atlanta, I had met a woman at a professional networking event named Gloria. Gloria was 51 years old at the time, a commercial real estate investor who had been buying, renovating, and repositioning properties in the Atlanta metro area for 20 years. She wore reading glasses on a chain and had the kind of handshake that left no ambiguity about where she stood. We ended up talking for 2 hours at that event. She asked smart questions and listened to the answers, which in my experience is a skill that becomes rarer the more successful someone is. At the end of the conversation, she handed me her card and said, "Come by my office sometime. I think you understand things." I called her 3 days later. Over the following year, Gloria became the most important professional relationship of my life. Not a mentor in the formal sense, more like a person who had already walked the road I was trying to walk and was willing to turn around occasionally and point at the parts worth paying attention to. She showed me how she evaluated properties, how she thought about neighborhood trajectories, how she structured her acquisitions, how she built relationships with lenders, how she managed renovations without losing her entire profit margin to the unexpected. She taught me how to read a city the way some people read a book, how to see what was coming before it arrived. I absorbed everything, and I began to save with a new kind of urgency. When I was 26, with $62,000 saved over 4 years of careful, deliberate, sometimes painful choices, I bought my first property. It was a single-family home in an East Atlanta neighborhood that was in the early stages of a transition I had been watching for 2 years. The house needed significant work. The roof was aging. The kitchen was original to the 1970s. One bathroom had a persistent water issue that had warped the floor. I paid $189,000 for it, put 20% down, financed the rest. I want to tell you about the weekend I closed on that house because it is one of the clearest memories I have. I drove to the property after leaving the title company. I parked in the driveway, and I sat in my car, and I looked at that house for probably 15 minutes. It was not beautiful. Not yet. The gutters were hanging at a slight angle on the left side. The front garden was overgrown in a way that suggested nobody had tended it in at least 2 seasons. One of the shutters on the second-floor window was missing entirely. But it was mine, and I had not asked a single person in my family for their opinion or their approval or their help. I renovated that house over the following 8 months while working full-time at Garrison Group. I did some of the work myself on weekends and evenings. Painting, trim work, landscaping, the things I could do. I hired licensed contractors for the roof, the kitchen, the bathroom, and the electrical updates. I made mistakes. I overspent on the kitchen by $11,000 because I changed my specifications midway through and absorbed the cost of the change. I learned from that. I did not make it again. By month 9, the house was transformed. I rented it within 3 weeks of listing. The rental income covered my mortgage with $620 remaining every single month. I remember standing in that empty renovated kitchen the day the first tenant signed their lease and thinking, this is what it feels like to build something that works while you are asleep. I did not tell my family, not because I was ashamed. Please hear that clearly. Not because I was ashamed, but because I had tried once, early on, to share the direction I was headed and had been met with enough concern and caution and barely concealed skepticism that I had made a conscious decision. Some things you build in private, some things you reveal when they are finished, and some rooms do not deserve an invitation to the construction site. Over the next 4 years, I continued to build. I purchased a second property, a duplex in a neighborhood 2 miles from the first house, when I was 27. Both units were rented within 6 weeks. I purchased a third property, a small commercial retail space, when I was 28. It sat in a corridor that I had watched carefully for 18 months, and I had timed the acquisition to coincide with 2 new anchor businesses opening on the same block within the previous year. The retail space was leased to a boutique within 90 days of my purchase. At Garrison Group, my career continued to climb. I was promoted to Associate Director of Acquisitions at 29. At 30, I was invited into an ownership structure for a development project the firm was structuring, a partial equity stake in a mixed-use development in a suburb south of Atlanta. I negotiated that stake carefully. I brought in my own legal representation. I read every document twice before signing anything. The stake cost me a significant portion of my available capital at the time. It was the best financial decision I have ever made. I need to tell you about something else that happened during this period, because it matters to the story. I had a relationship during these years. His name was David. He was an architect who had his own small firm doing residential design work. We were together for 2.5 years. David was a good man, patient, creative, someone who actually listened when I talked about what I was building. He also wanted to get married and have children on a timeline that I was not ready to commit to. We had this conversation multiple times over the last year of our relationship. He was not wrong to want those things. I was not wrong to need more time. But those two things could not be reconciled, and we parted ways when I was 31, with the specific sadness of something that was real but not right. My family, predictably, had opinions about this. My mother said, "Natalie, you cannot put everything else first and expect people to wait." Aunt Cecile said, "A good man is not something you put on hold." Kevin said nothing directly, but Brenda mentioned 3 times at the next family gathering that she and Kevin had known from the first date that they were right for each other, which was Brenda's way of making a point without technically making it. I listened to all of it. I said, "I know what I'm doing." They looked at each other in that way. The way that means we hope she is right, but we do not believe she is. I kept building. By the time I was 32 years old, I had 5 properties in my portfolio. I had an equity stake in a mixed-use development that was 18 months from its first distribution. My salary at Garrison Group had climbed to $112,000 annually. My combined rental income after all expenses was over $6,000 per month. And I had done something that I want to describe carefully because it is the piece of this story that I am most proud of. I had quietly built a financial management system for myself that would have made my accounting professors at university genuinely proud. Every dollar that came in was directed with a purpose before it arrived. A percentage to ongoing property reserves, a percentage to a new acquisitions fund, a percentage to a personal investment portfolio I had been building since I was 25, a percentage to what I called my Freedom Fund, the account that was not tied to any specific property or investment, just mine, liquid, growing, Every month, without fail, without exception. People ask sometimes when they hear this kind of story how I stayed motivated during the years when nobody could see what I was building. And my honest answer is this: I was not motivated by the vision of the reveal. I was not working toward the moment at the kitchen table. I was working because building something felt more honest than anything else I had ever done. Because every decision I made with intention and discipline was an act of proof to myself that the person my family kept waiting to fail did not exist. That person had never existed. She was a story they had written without my participation, and I was under no obligation to live inside it. The motivation was not about them. It was never about them. It was about me. And the day I fully understood that distinction was the day everything accelerated. My 33rd birthday fell on a Saturday. My mother called in the morning. We talked for 12 minutes. She asked how I was. I said I was well. She said she was making her pound cake and asked if I was coming home soon. I said I would come home next month. She said good. She said happy birthday at the end of the call, the way you say something you have been waiting to say but kept getting distracted from. I thanked her. We hung up. I spent my birthday alone, which I want to say clearly was a choice and not a circumstance. I went to the farmer's market in the morning. I bought flowers and peaches and a loaf of sourdough. I took Fig for a long walk along the trail near my house. I made myself a proper dinner that evening, something I had learned to enjoy during the years of cooking everything at home to save money, and had never stopped, even after money was no longer the reason. At some point in the evening, I sat at my kitchen counter with a glass of wine, and I opened my banking app. Not for any particular reason. Habit, partly. I checked my accounts regularly, the way some people check the weather. Not anxiously, just as information. I looked at each account one at a time the way I always did. Operating account, property reserve funds, investment portfolio, the Freedom Fund, and then the cumulative view, the number that represented everything together, all the accounts, all the properties at current conservative estimated value, all the investment holdings. I sat with that number for a long time. Not because it surprised me. I had been watching it grow for years. I knew approximately what it was going to say before I opened the screen. But there is something different about seeing a number in full on the night of your birthday, when you are alone in a kitchen you love in a house that is not yours, but belongs to someone living the life you always knew you were going to build. I looked at that number, and I thought about that driveway, my mother standing in it. You do not have to do this the hard way. I thought about the engagement party living room. Aunt Cecile. 22 people. Still in progress. I thought about the phone call with Kevin. You do not have a backup plan. I thought about every Sunday dinner where the question underneath every question was whether I was going to eventually admit that they had been right. And then I thought about something else. I thought about Fig sleeping in the next room on his oversized dog bed that I had absolutely spoiled him with because I could, and he deserved it. I thought about Gloria, who had called me 2 weeks earlier to tell me that the mixed-use development was on track for its first distribution ahead of schedule. I thought about the tenant in my first East Atlanta house, a schoolteacher named Ms. Okoye, who had sent me a text message the previous week asking if she could plant a small garden in the side yard, and I had said yes, of course, plant whatever you like. I thought about all the ordinary, beautiful things that existed in my life that had nothing to do with whether my family believed in me or not. And I made a decision. Not out of anger, not out of a need for revenge, out of something more like completion. I had been building in private for long enough. It was time to let my family see. Not to hurt them, not to prove them wrong as an act of triumph, but because I was tired of the separation. I was tired of being two different versions of myself. The Natalie in Atlanta who had built something real, and the Natalie at the dinner table who everyone was still waiting to come home. I was one person, and it was time for my family to meet her. The following month I drove home. I did not tell anyone I was coming for any specific reason. I said I was just coming for Sunday lunch. My mother made fried chicken and rice and her green beans that she cooked low and slow for 2 hours with smoked turkey neck and came out tasting like something you could not replicate in any restaurant. Darnell came. Kevin and Brenda came with the kids. Aunt Cecile came because Aunt Cecile came to everything. My grandmother, Nana Ruth, who was 81 and sharper than anyone in the room cared to admit, came with Darnell because she lived with him now. 11 people around my mother's table. We ate lunch. It was good. It was warm. The children were loud in the specific, delightful way that children are loud when they feel safe. My grandmother told a story about something that had happened at her church decades ago that I am fairly certain I had heard 4 times before, and which was funnier every time. My mother looked comfortable, settled, happy in the particular way she was happy when her people were gathered under her roof. I looked at her from across the table and felt something that I want to describe carefully. Not resentment, not triumph. Something more like love and grief mixed together in equal measure. Love for the woman who had raised me largely alone and had done it with more strength than she ever received credit for. And grief for the years she had spent not seeing me clearly. Both things were true. Both things could exist at the same time. After the dishes were cleared and the children were settled in the living room with the television, and the adults were gathered in the kitchen with their second cups of coffee, Aunt Cecile said the thing she said at some point during every gathering. She said, "Natalie, what is going on with you these days? Still at that same company?" I said yes, still at Garrison Group. She said, "What exactly do you do there again?" I said I manage acquisitions analysis and oversee the underwriting process for commercial real estate investments. She said, that sounds complicated." Kevin said, "Real estate can be risky. The market goes up and down." Darnell said nothing but had his arms crossed in the way he did when he was agreeing with someone without fully committing to it. My mother was wiping the counter. She was not looking at me. I put my coffee cup down. I reached into my bag. I pulled out my phone. I opened my banking app. I pulled up the cumulative view, the full picture, every account, every asset, the number I had looked at on my birthday and decided it was time to show. I placed the phone face up on my mother's kitchen table. I said, "I wanted to show you all something." The kitchen went quiet in a way that kitchens do not usually go quiet. 11 people, and suddenly the only sound was the television in the next room where the children were watching something with talking animals. My grandmother leaned forward first. She was 81 years old, and her eyesight was not what it had been, but she leaned forward, and she looked at that screen, and then she sat back in her chair and looked at me and said nothing at all. Which from Nana Ruth was more significant than anything she could have said. My mother came to the table. She pulled her reading glasses down from her forehead. She looked at the screen. She picked up the phone. She looked at it for what felt like a full minute. She set it down very carefully, like it might break, like she might break. My Aunt Cecile had gone completely still. Kevin was looking at the screen from across the table with an expression I had never seen on his face before, a kind of recalibration happening in real time. Darnell uncrossed his arms. Brenda said very softly, "Lord." Nobody said anything. I let the silence do its work. Then I said, "That is from this quarter. I have 5 rental properties in Atlanta. I have an equity stake in a commercial development that distributed for the first time last month, and I have been growing an investment portfolio since I was 25. I picked up my phone. I put it back in my bag. I said, "Lunch was wonderful, Mama. Those green beans were perfect." And I went to the living room to play with the children. I could hear them in the kitchen after I left. Not specific words, just the quality of the sound. The particular murmur of people processing something that has reconfigured what they thought they knew. I sat on the living room floor with Kevin's youngest, a 4-year-old named Jordan, who wanted me to help him build a tower out of wooden blocks and then very deliberately knock it over, which we did approximately 6 times with great satisfaction on both our parts. My grandmother came to find me first. She settled into the armchair near the window with the careful deliberateness of someone who has learned to move slowly, but has not slowed down at all where it counts. She looked at me. She said, "How long?" I said, 7 years. Seriously building. About 5 years seriously. She nodded. She said, "Your grandfather had a saying. He said, 'The person who needs the least permission is the person who gets the most done.'" She looked out the window for a moment. Then she said, "You got it done, baby." Those 4 words, from Nana Ruth. I will not pretend they did not mean something to me. I will not perform indifference I do not feel. They meant a great deal. She had seen me, clearly, and she had named it. My mother came to find me about 30 minutes later. She stood in the doorway of the living room for a moment. Jordan had moved on to a puzzle, and I was sitting on the floor with my back against the couch watching him. My mother said, "Can we talk in the kitchen?" I said yes. We went to the kitchen. She sat across from me at the table where the phone had been. She was quiet for a moment, in the way that she was quiet when she was choosing words carefully, which she did not do often, and which always meant the words mattered. She said, "I did not know." I said, "I know." She said, "I should have asked more. I asked about the job, about whether you were okay. I did not ask about what you were building." I said, "No, you did not." She looked at her hands. She said, "I was scared for you. I think I have been scared for you since the day you drove away. And sometimes when I am scared, I say things that sound like doubt, but they are really just fear." I sat with that for a moment. I thought about the driveway. You do not have to do this the hard way. I thought about every visit where the question underneath the question was really just my mother asking, "Are you safe? Are you okay? Am I going to lose you to a city that does not know your name?" And I understood something that I had not fully understood before. She had not been trying to diminish me. She had been trying to keep me from the kind of pain she could not protect me from once I drove 7 hours away and started making choices she could not supervise. Her doubt had been dressed in the clothes of criticism, but underneath it was a fear she did not know how to say out loud. I do not say this to excuse it. Please hear me clearly, because the impact of those years of being looked at like someone who needed to be guided, like someone who was always in progress and never arriving, that impact was real regardless of the intention. Real things hurt regardless of why they were done. But understanding the why made room for something that I did not expect to feel at that table. Something that felt like it might be the beginning of forgiveness. Not because she deserved it on some transactional level, but because I did. Because carrying the weight of my family's misperception of me had cost me things I was not fully aware I had spent until I sat in that kitchen and felt some of it lift. My mother looked at me and said, "I am proud of you, Natalie." She said it the way you say something when you mean it more than you have the words for. Simple. Direct. No performance. I said, "Thank you, Mama." And then, because I am my mother's daughter, and we do not make things easy for ourselves or anyone else, I said, "I needed to hear that a long time ago." She looked at me. She said, "I know." And that was it. That was the whole conversation. But it was also everything. Kevin found me before I left that afternoon. He pulled me aside near the front door. He said, "Natalie, I owe you an apology." I said, "You were worried about me, I know that." He said, "I was condescending. There is a difference between being worried and not believing in someone. I did not believe in you the way I should have, and I am sorry for that." Kevin had never in 30 years of being my brother said anything quite like that to me. I looked at him for a moment. I said, "I appreciate that, Kevin. I genuinely do." He nodded. He hugged me. It was the hug of someone who had just recalibrated something significant and was still finding his footing in the new position. I held it for a moment. Then I went to say goodbye to everyone else. Aunt Cecile hugged me at the door. She said, "Natalie, you are something else." I said, "Yes, ma'am." She shook her head. She said, "I hope you know I always believed you had it in you." I smiled. I said, "I know, Aunt Cecile." I did not push on that sentence. Some things you let stand the way they are. Darnell walked me to my car. Darnell was the least verbal person in my family, and also in many ways the most perceptive. He said, "Did you plan that?" I said, "The showing them or the building it?" He said, "Both." I said, "I planned the building it. The showing them just felt like the right time." He was quiet. Then he said, I am going to need you to teach me some of this stuff. I laughed. For the first time that entire afternoon, a real, full, unguarded laugh. I said, yes, I will teach you. He nodded. He tapped the roof of my car twice the way Darnell did, instead of saying goodbye. I drove away. I want to take you back now. I want to walk you through the actual construction of what appeared on that phone screen because I think it matters. I think when women in particular share stories of financial success, the numbers get softened or omitted because there is a cultural discomfort with women claiming their own accomplishments directly. I am not interested in that discomfort. So let me tell you clearly what I built and how I built it. Property 1. The single-family home in East Atlanta. Purchased at 26 for $189,000. Renovated over 8 months at a total cost of $41,000, including the overage on the kitchen I mentioned earlier. Current estimated market value based on comparable sales in the neighborhood at the time I showed my family, $410,000. Monthly net rental income after all expenses, $840. Property 2, the duplex. Purchased at 27 for $220,000. Light renovation on one unit totaling $14,000. Both units rented within 6 weeks of acquisition. Current estimated market value, $360,000. Monthly net rental income, $1,080. Property 3. The commercial retail space. Purchased at 28 for $315,000. No significant renovation required. Tenant signed a 5-year lease within 90 days of purchase, with annual escalation clauses built in. Current estimated value, $470,000. Monthly net income, $2,200. Property 4. A 2-unit property I purchased at 30 in a neighborhood that had been on my watch list for 2 years. The acquisition was opportunistic. A seller who needed to close quickly and accepted my all-cash offer at a discount to market. Total purchase price, $190,000. Both units rented within 3 weeks. Monthly net income after all expenses, $1,040. Property 5. A single-family home I purchased at 32 in a suburb north of Atlanta that I had identified as being in an early trajectory shift, similar to the neighborhood where I bought my first property. Purchase price, $268,000. Renovation cost, $33,000. Rented 6 weeks after completion. Monthly net income, $920. Combined monthly net rental income across all 5 properties at the time I showed my family, $6,080. That is money coming in every single month regardless of whether I go to work. Regardless of whether my employer changes its mind. Regardless of whether the economy has a difficult quarter. Money that works while I sleep. The equity stake in the mixed-use development. This one I will describe in general terms because it involves other parties whose details are not mine to share. What I can tell you is that the first quarterly distribution I received from that stake was larger than my entire first-year salary at Garrison Group. That distribution landed in my account on a Thursday afternoon. I was in a meeting when the notification came through. I looked at my phone under the conference table. I put it back in my pocket. I finished the meeting. The investment portfolio. Built from the time I was 25. Index funds primarily. Some individual positions and sectors I understood well through my work. Reinvested dividends without exception for 9 years. The Freedom Fund. The account that is not attached to any property or investment. Liquid. Growing. Mine. When you add the current estimated value of the 5 properties, the investment portfolio, the value of the equity stake, the Freedom Fund, the total that appeared on my phone screen on my mother's kitchen table, over $2 million, $2,147,000, and some change. Built by a woman who had been told she did not have a backup plan. I want to say one more thing about this, and then I want to move on. None of this was luck. I know that sounds obvious, but I think it needs to be said directly, because women's financial success is often attributed to luck or circumstance, or to having met the right person at the right time in a way that subtly removes their agency from the story. This was not luck. This was 7 years of early mornings and late evenings, and decisions made carefully, and mistakes absorbed and corrected, and knowledge built, one conversation, and one spreadsheet, and one renovation project at a time. I built this, with my own mind and my own hands and my own choices, and I would do every single part of it again. Things shifted between me and my family after that Sunday lunch. Not overnight, not dramatically, not in the way that happens in movies where one scene changes everything and everyone emerges different on the other side. Slowly, imperfectly, in the way real things change between real people. My mother and I started talking differently, not about more things necessarily, but with more honesty underneath the things we were already talking about. She started asking different questions. Instead of, "Are you okay down there?" she started asking, "What are you working on?" Instead of, "Have you met anyone?" she started asking, "How is Fig?" Small shifts, but shifts. And sometimes the quality of a question tells you more about a relationship than the answer does. Darnell came to Atlanta in the spring. He had asked, about 3 weeks after the Sunday lunch, if I would be willing to sit with him and walk him through the basics of how I thought about investing. I said yes. He came for a long weekend. We spent Saturday afternoon at my kitchen table with my legal pad and a pot of coffee, and I walked him through the fundamentals. Not the specific numbers of my portfolio, the thinking behind it, the framework, the way to look at a decision before making it. He took 4 pages of notes. When he left, he said, "I wasted a lot of years." I said, "You are not wasting this one." He nodded. He drove home. 3 months later, he called me to tell me he had opened an investment account for the first time in his life. I said, "Good. Let it sit and do not touch it." He laughed. He said, "Yes, ma'am." Kevin sent me a text about a month after the Sunday lunch. It said, "I have been thinking about what you showed us. I think Brenda and I need to talk to a financial advisor. Do you have someone you trust you could recommend?" I sent him the name of a woman I knew. Excellent, honest, no nonsense. He made an appointment within the week. This is not a full reconciliation story. I want to be honest about that. Kevin and I do not have the same relationship we might have had if things had been different. There are years of a particular dynamic between us that do not simply disappear. But we are building something more honest than what was there before. That feels like enough to work with. Aunt Cecile does not ask me what my plans are anymore. She asks about my properties. She has become genuinely interested, in the way that people become interested in things once they understand that the thing is real. She asked me recently whether I thought the commercial real estate market was going to be affected by the interest rate environment. I told her my honest analysis. She listened carefully. She said, that makes sense." And then she told me I should bring Fig to the next family gathering because she had always wanted to meet him. I said I would. Gloria, who started all of this in a way she may not fully know, called me recently. She said she was thinking about stepping back from active property management over the next few years. She asked if I would be interested in having a conversation about what that might look like in terms of her portfolio. I said I would be very interested. We are having that conversation. I do not know where it leads yet. But I know who I am when I sit down to a conversation like that. I know what I have built and what I know and what I am capable of. And that knowledge does not require anyone else to confirm it. My mother's pound cake is still the best I have ever eaten. I drove home last month, no special occasion, just drove home on a Saturday morning because I wanted to. She made the pound cake. We sat on the back porch in the afternoon with our coffee and the pound cake, and she talked about the garden she was trying to grow in the backyard, and I talked about a property decision I was considering, and she listened in a way she had not listened before. Like she was curious, like she was trying to understand something rather than evaluate it. At some point she said, "I think about what you said that morning in the driveway, that you were going to do it your way." I said I remembered. She said, "I did not believe you." I said, "I know." She said, "You should have made me believe you." I looked at her. I said, "Mama, that was your job, not mine." She looked at the garden for a moment. Then she said, "Yes, it was." We sat with that. The afternoon light was doing that particular thing it does in the South in late spring, where everything looked slightly golden and slightly tired at the same time, and I felt something settle in me. Not the triumph I had imagined at 26 when I was renovating floors and imagining the day my family would understand. Something quieter than that. Something that felt like peace. The peace of having built something that could not be argued with. The peace of knowing that you never stopped when stopping would have been easier. The peace of sitting on your mother's porch eating pound cake after years of being the one they did not quite believe in and knowing, in your bones, that their belief was never the thing that built you. Yours was. Here is what I want you to take from this story. If you are a woman who is building something that the people around you cannot see yet, I want you to hear this clearly. You do not need the room to be quiet in order to think. You do not need their faith in order to have yours. You do not need permission from people who do not understand your vision to continue building it. The doubt of people who love you is real. The impact of being consistently underestimated by the people who are supposed to see you most clearly is real. I am not going to tell you it does not hurt. It does. It can hurt in ways that are quiet and persistent and easy to mistake for something wrong with you rather than something wrong with the room. But hear this. The hurt and the building can happen at the same time. You can feel unseen and still lay the next brick. You can sit at the table where nobody believes in you and drive home afterward and open your laptop and do the next thing. You can absorb the doubt without becoming it. I want to say something specific to anyone who is in the early stages of building. The years when nobody can see what you are doing are not wasted years. They are protected years. Because the vision you carry before it becomes undeniable is fragile. Not because the vision itself is weak, but because external doubt at the wrong moment can interrupt internal belief before it has had time to become conviction. Build in private if you need to. Protect the vision until it can protect itself. And then, when it is ready, place it on the table and let the silence speak. My family treated me like a failure for years. They did not do this out of malice. They did it out of fear dressed in the clothing of concern. And I do not hate them for it. But I also did not wait for them to stop doing it before I started building. That is the thing I want you to hold. You do not wait for the room to change before you start. You start. And the starting changes the room. The bank statement I placed on my mother's kitchen table was not revenge. It was not a moment of triumph over people who had been wrong. It was something more honest than that. It was proof. Not to them. To me. Proof that the version of myself I had believed in alone, in apartments and on job sites and in spreadsheets at midnight, had been real all along. Had always been real. Even when nobody else in the room could see her. My grandmother said the person who needs the least permission is the person who gets the most done. I needed very little permission, and I got a great deal done. If you are somewhere in this story right now, if you are 7 years in, or 7 months in, or 7 days into something that nobody around you believes in yet, stay. Do the next thing. Learn the next skill. Save the next dollar. Buy the next property. Build the next piece. And one day, when the time is right, you will place it on the table. You will not need to say a word. The number will say everything. The silence will be your answer. And that silence will sound like every doubt ever spoken about you being slowly and completely undone. I know, because I heard it. In my mother's kitchen, on a Sunday afternoon, with pound cake on the counter and my grandmother in the corner, and 11 people who had spent years waiting for me to come home. I had never left. I had just been building. And now they could finally see it. If this story stayed with you, I would love for you to subscribe. Because there are more stories like this one. Stories about people who built quietly, who worked without applause, who proved something not to the world but to themselves. And if you are living a story like this right now, leave it in the comments. Not because I need the engagement, but because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is write it down and let someone else see it. You are not alone in this, and you are not as far behind as the room sometimes makes you feel. Keep building.